Hello, everyone, and thank you for so much for joining me tonight for Stop It Caregiver Behaviors That Impede Progress. My name is Cheryl Ryan Chan, and I have been a professional speaker and person centered planning facilitator for a long time now, over 10 years. I like to say that I tackle the tough topics and these are those things that both families and professionals, providers, so on and so forth, educators don't really like to discuss or aren't really sure how to approach. Tonight's presentation is one of those things. It is one of those tough topics. Like all of my workshops and presentations, I used my professional experience working with hundreds of families all across the country over the past many years, as well as my own lived experience as mom to a young man with profound autism and severe intellectual disabilities. His name is Nicky. I wrote this particular presentation back in 2020 when I realized that there were patterns of behavior that I was seeing over and over again with families and parents and providers and all of the people in these individual circles of support that in fact do and can impede the progress of the person that they love. It is unintentional, and we're going to talk about that tonight. And we're going to address this in a way that is respectful. It is important for everyone to understand that when I talk about this topic, it's not easy to hear and it's not easy to give. And it certainly is not some blame game whatsoever. But I want you to sit back and listen and really think about how it might be applied to you. You know, this has been my most popular workshop of all of the ones that are written over the years. And I know why. It's because it resonates with every single one of us, whether we are direct support workers or agency representatives, family members, or friends. So it is really an honor to be able to present this workshop, and I appreciate you visiting my website. I encourage this video to be viewed by individuals, families together, groups, organizations. I encourage conversation and reflection, and I always appreciate feedback for all of the workshops that I do. So you are welcome to reach out to me with questions or any sort of comments you'd like to give. I'd like to start this presentation today with a single sentence, and here it is. The greatest gift that we can give our loved ones is to be prepared for life without us. And I'm going to say that again. The greatest gift that we can give our loved ones is to be prepared for life without us. Again, that is a really hard sentence to kind of swallow, but I want to use tonight to help you understand what I mean by that and the critical importance of shifting your perspective and embracing this concept. The barriers to this are ours alone. They do not belong to our children. They are ours. And there are a lot of things that drive us. And we're going to talk about all of those things tonight. So let's get started. It really boils down to two words. And they are overprotection and underpreparation. Those are the two words that really came to mind to me when I wrote this back in 2020 that summarize what the most damaging pattern that I had been seeing with families is: overprotection and underpreparation. I've been seeing it with families for years and years, but the truth is I recognized all of this in myself. So I'm going to throw myself under the bus first. I'm actually going to be throwing myself under the bus a lot tonight. And some of it is a little bit fun. So stay with me. I am the first one to say I overprotected and underprepared Nicky for being out in the adult system. Nicky actually left my home when he was about 14 years old and went to a residential placement. So it was a little earlier than adulthood, so to speak, as the system defines it. But when he did leave my home, I wish, sometimes I think back to those years prior to him leaving, and I think if I had had somebody plant the seed that I'm planting for you tonight of some of the things that I could control and could do to support him, then maybe some of the outcomes of his life might have been a little bit better. Before we do anything and talking about why these things happen, how these things happen, and what I mean by that, we have to make sure that we address what drives us. There are so many things that drive us to overprotect and underprepare. And I want to make sure that we acknowledge those things. But again, they are ours. They are internal. Remember that as we go through some of these. And I'm not a professional psychiatrist or anything like that. So again, I'm drawing from my own lived experience in a lot of these things. I'm driven, as many of us are, by natural nurturing instinct that doesn't progress as they age. Now, that's one where I go, that might need a little bit more explanation. If you have any other children, then you can think about who are neurotypical like I do. I think about them. And I also think if you don't have any other children, think about your own upbringing. It is natural for all of us to nurture our children from the time that they're born and then all throughout their lifespan. However, that natural nurturing changes throughout time. We have expectations of our children. We have expectations of that they will progress in their learning, that they will progress in their behaviors, that they will begin to acquire life skills and independent living skills. And if you think about it, as they get older, of course, we have higher expectations. We want them to do better. We want them to be ready to fly. And what happens with our kids with disabilities is that naturally, and yet a little unnaturally, we overprotect and underprepare because we are so fearful. We have both internal and external fears around what's going to happen to my child when I'm gone, or even as they get older and I'm not with them all the time. We panic. We panic around these things. And so that actually has the effect of making us draw in even closer and get that mama and papa bear protection going on. And sometimes that even causes us to shrink their worlds because we remove opportunities for them to do things independently because we're so fearful. We are surviving from 1 hour to the next. Just getting through each day is tough. And sometimes we can't even begin to think about the future. Other things that drive us, trauma from our own childhood, from experiences during our journey with our loved one, or from other relationships. The trauma response of filling the space is one that becomes a very big barrier to the things that I want to talk about today. Guilt. I don't think I need to say anything more about guilt. We all know what we're talking about if we're caregivers of any kind. Guilt can be a driver for how we protect or allow our children to be lifelong learners. But what happens when we allow these things to become barriers to our children learning and advancing and progressing is that the impact is greater on them than it is on us. There is no impact on us that can be at all compared to the impact on our loved ones when we overprotect and underprepare. Here are some of the things in particular that I've seen and studies have shown about overprotection and underpreparation. Behaviors become the things that drive everything, because when there are no demands at home, then later on others do place demands. The shock and resistance and unpreparedness for what that means and what's going on and how to respond to it make our loved ones a, quote, behavior problem. Lack of preparedness for the real world or for the next environments in adulthood mean far more limits to housing and living options, more churn by caregivers, inconsistency, and anxiety. We see reduced self-esteem because those we love believe they can't when we always do for them, or we always stop them from trying because, or sometimes stop them from trying because of our own fears. There is a greater propensity for abuse when we are handing over to the adult world or the next caregiving setting a person who is unprepared to be able to manage themselves in the next setting. What else happens? Relationships between family and systems caregivers are difficult and can cause breakdowns in communication or even dismissal. I'm working on another workshop that'll be, hopefully I'll be able to introduce later on in 2025. And it's really about this in particular. There is strong evidence, and again, I know I don't even have to point to strong evidence because we're all living this, that when our loved ones go to the next caregiving setting, parents come in and loved ones come in already with a lot of distrust, and that gets reciprocated. Staff members, professionals view parents with a level of distrust. And so there are barriers arriving with our loved ones, and those can be really damaging. Isolation occurs when we are not presenting the next caregiver environment with a person who's able to manage themselves in the new setting and adjust. And then finally, depression, hoarding, and eviction. I personally have seen all of these things happen. Hoarding and eviction has happened with individuals that I have worked with who are those who are able to have the skill sets to be able to maintain themselves semi-independently, but without the skill sets to the practical skill sets of what all of those responsibilities are. Instead, I've seen parents and loved ones kind of put their loved one into a housing situation where they have the autonomy without the skill sets and the understanding of their responsibilities. So again, some of the results of the barriers that drive us as caregivers have the greatest impact on those we love. But like I said earlier, you don't have to take my word for it. I've done a lot of research around this topic, and here are a few things that I'd like to point out. These are from some books and some papers that I provide in my slides after this presentation. Lowered expectations may take the form of sympathy, kindness, or generosity, but they can be quite harmful to the individual by limiting the amount of constructive feedback that is received. This negative feedback keeps the individual in an inferior and dependent position. When parents overindulge or overprotect the special needs child, they take away the experiences which enable the child to be successful in life. The consequences of overprotection include lower self-esteem, feeling less capable, and reduced opportunity for growth. And finally, this treatment can shape a person's attitude toward his or her disability and limit what they are willing to do, regardless of what they are able to do. So again, these are all things that can be found in the research. And I think that's important to remember. So let's move on and talk about kind of the practical things around this topic. How do I really get ready for this? And by I mean us as caregivers, because a lot of times I'll get to this point and people will start raising their hands and going, yeah, but what do I start doing? Well, we're going to talk about strategies in just a second. It's always important to me to present a topic and then really get into the nitty-gritty of how you can change things, shift your perspective, and practical strategies. So let's start with shifting our perspective, because again, I'm talking to you about you, my fellow caregivers. So here are some things I want you to remember. For your hearts, let's start there. I want you to honor the bond that you have with your loved one, but don't let it become your impenetrable wall. Instead, make it your teaching and learning strategy. When it's time for your loved one to be moving forward or moving on and progressing into their next environment, here's a practical truth. Do not expect caregivers of any kind to replicate exactly how you are doing things. Do expect them to do less than what you are doing. I think of myself, and when my son first went into his first shared living situation, where he continues to be 13 years later, boy, I spent about a month with the shared living provider preparing him for exactly how to communicate with Nikki, exactly how to use all of his visual schedules, exactly how he is going to respond to everything that he did, exactly what was going to happen, and exactly how to manage it. And he patiently waited. He was very kind. He listened carefully and so on. And it all went out the window, I would say about a month after Nikki moved in. But that's because they had created their own forms of communication. They had bonded and began to bond and then continued to bond in a way that was very different from the way that I had been doing things. And in fact, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, Nikki blossomed. Nikki started doing things that I never was able to get him to do. It was amazing. Practically speaking, you should also know this. Agencies planning to care for your loved one in the future have the ability to say no. If you've not prepared them to be the best they can be, they will be given fewer options. Nikki wasn't accepted into any of the programs at the time that he moved or needed to move residentially. And that was the impediments and the barriers were all around his behavior, safety, and so on and so forth. And so I ended up with one option and one option only. And that's where he was for 5 years. Things like staffing and support levels are determined based on your reporting of your loved one's skills prior to arrival. So underreporting and overreporting is a serious danger to transition planning and getting appropriate services. I know a lot of us know kind of the urban, well, not an urban myth. What am I trying to think of? The story behind when you're applying for eligibility for services. And that is, we all say to each other, don't ever put on the best face. Don't ever tell the best stories. Don't cast your loved one in a good light. Tell them the worst stories. Tell them the things that are the most horrifying so that they get more services. And that can be a matter of underreporting or overreporting. So sometimes we do that. We take our own community advice. And I've also seen families who have overreported and said that their person is capable of doing things like basic personal hygiene stuff. And the truth is, what I often see happening is, they'll report that their person can, for example, take a shower on their own. But we have to take a step back. This is one example, and say, okay, but what does on their own mean? I mean, I can get my son to get into the shower and wash pretty well, but I have to remind him. I have to stand at the door and make sure he's getting fully undressed. I have to stand by the shower and make sure he is doing the washing that he needs to do, and so on and so forth. So I may be inclined to say that he is capable of showering independently. And in my mind, I've decided that's what independence means. Or I may say, no, he can't do any personal care at all. And so with one extreme or the other, the service expectations are going to shift And then you may end up running into trouble later on when your loved one doesn't actually perform, either overperforms or underperforms based on your reporting. These are all really important things to understand and to know. Further, I believe that as caregivers, we provide a lot of arguments that are not really in harmony when we are preparing our loved ones for the next setting. We actually do this quite often. And I want us to take a respectful step back and look at a couple of these things that I hear over and over again that just they don't jive. So let's talk about them. One is, I want my loved one treated equally and with respect and dignity. So we're going to say that to the next caregivers. We're going to say that to the next people in, whoever is supporting our person. And we're going to demand it. I want them to be treated equally and with respect and dignity. But then what are we doing when we're at home? We do just about everything because they can't. And I expect the next person to do all those same things. So do you see where we're giving mixed messages? I want my loved one to have friends and attend social events. I think that's reasonable. And I think that's delightful, and it's an important piece of our advocacy. But when we're saying at home, I can't or won't take my loved one to social events because it's too hard or too scary, and they don't have any friends, how much of that might be things that we're doing that are barriers to finding friends? I know I did that. I know I still actually do that. I am not able to take my son out by myself to any place. And that has nothing to do with Nikki, because he goes out to places constantly with his day program, with his shared living providers, with friends. He truly does. He has a great life, but I won't do it because the last time I tried, we had a traumatic experience and I just cannot get over the fear and the trauma of what happened then. My loved one has the right to find a job and have opportunities to participate in their community. When we make that statement, you are absolutely correct. You are absolutely correct. But what I also hear often is that the community needs to learn how to accept my loved one. If they get a job, the employer will just have to adjust and be compassionate. I will never argue that, never once. But the practical truth is that's not what happens. We are not there yet as a society. We all are going to have different opinions about how far we've come, certainly. But to say that the community needs to learn how to accept my loved one and just leave it at that, I think does a disservice to our loved ones. The flip side of that, because it's not wrong, but the other side of that is one that we don't often think about, and that is, it's my responsibility to get my person to the level of being ready for the barriers, the challenges, and the responsibilities that come with all of this. I have to be ready to present my loved one as prepared as they can be for that next setting, whether it's a job or a day program or a new housing situation, whatever that is. So one thing that I've hopefully have driven home in this part of my presentation is that the learning curve is ours. It's not theirs. Our loved ones are ready to learn. They are capable of learning. They're all capable of learning. And any learning that they can receive is going to benefit them, just like any learning that you receive or I receive or our other neurotypical kids receive. All of that is going to absolutely benefit them. So when we overprotect and underprepare, it's really about our need to be better ready to embrace these concepts, to embrace the strategies that I am now going to be sharing. Let's talk about changing caregiver behaviors that become barriers to progress for citizens with disabilities. And again, a reminder, I'm not talking about your kids, I'm talking about you and I. So first and foremost, I want you to arm yourself. There's a lot here, but I think all of it is important. Let's start by committing to opening yourself up to vulnerability and truth and to preparing for change. That is a big one. That is a big one. And we're talking about doing it right now. I want you to think about reaching out to others on the journey. If you think you're alone, you are dead wrong. There are thousands of us here in New England alone, let alone the rest of the country. You have access to all sorts of supports for yourself to get yourself ready to embrace these concepts and to get yourself ready to help your loved one be stronger and readier than ever. But it takes vulnerability and it takes accepting some of the things that I'm talking about. Reach out to others on the journey. Consider therapy. I'm just going to let that lie right there. Get buy-in from the entire household. I also see this a lot in the travels that I've done and the hundreds of families that I've worked with. A lot of times, mom, dad, husband, wife, those one or two people who are in charge of the household do not necessarily open up communication in a way that I think is the most helpful. And what I mean by that is have those conversations about who's going to do what with regard specifically to caregiving for a person with disabilities. You know, it became early on for my husband and I a huge barrier because we were tripping over each other to try to take care of things for our disabled son. And my husband had his ideas of how that should be done. I had my ideas of how that should be done. And we often disconnected and didn't agree. In the meantime, my husband was out at work every day. I was at home every day. And so all of those things were churning as well. It really opening up communication and saying, let's have an honest conversation about the expectations of what each of us can do is really important. Ultimately, my husband and I ended up kind of going in the traditional way, so to speak, because it was getting too difficult. And so finally we said, my husband will go and go out and do the job every day. I will stay at home and do that big job every day. And so with that, it will make sense for me to be the primary decision maker around caregiving for our son. Certainly, it is my responsibility to keep my husband readied and in the loop and feel included. But we ultimately agreed that I should be the one doing the regular decision making. Big decisions we will make together. And that worked for us. But we had to have that very intentional conversation. It didn't come naturally. We were tripping over ourselves, like I said, trying to be the first one to take care of our son. Create a plan with the educational team, therapists, and consultants. That's really, really important. And the reason for that is that, again, under the heading of communication, being able to have a plan that's consistent and everybody is on board with, that results in, this is not new news. We all know this about planning and so on and so forth through the IEP and ISP processes. But create that plan, and I'm going to talk about how to create that plan and what kind of plan it should be, and get everybody in that circle of support, all the professionals and all of the authentic, natural circle members to buy into this and understand what's being done. And then finally, dare I say, another way to arm yourself is to be self-compassionate. Self-care, everybody hates that term. I hate that term. It conjures up the whole idea of, oh, I got to go do yoga and massages, and I got to do this, and I got to do all these things, and I got to meditate every day. All of those things that kind of fall under, get my nails done, under self-care. But talk about barriers, money, time, caregiving, all of those things. So instead, I want to plant the seed of self-compassion. And here's what I mean by this. You're not going to be able to do everything every single day. that's absolutely perfect, that your loved one must have. You're not going to always be able to follow that schedule that your loved one right now is relying on at home. You're not always going to be able to make sure that you are 10 steps ahead of your loved one to mow the lawn, so to speak, and clear the air so that everything goes well every single day. It is okay. It's called being human, and you do not need to carry that, for one. And for two, I would present to you that, as we're going to talk about a little bit later, not being able to do that creates some change every once in a while, or maybe a little bit every day, that helps your loved one actually adjust to changes and pivot when necessary, and maybe not be able to do all the things that they want. Maybe dinner is going to be 20 minutes late, so on and so forth. I could build a whole list. But that speaks to the idea, the very critical function of flexibility. We're going to talk about that in just a few minutes because that's an important one. So, self-compassion. You're doing great. You are absolutely doing great, I promise. Continuing on the line of strategies, I want you to do a little bit of research, and I've done a little bit of it for you in the resources that I provide in these slides. What are the things that typical kids, neurotypical kids, are expected to do developmentally and socially? This needs to become our baseline for expectations for our loved ones, okay? I think a lot of times we become a little bit ableist, including myself, when I other my son and put him outside of the expectations because I don't want, a difficult life for him. I don't want a difficult moment for him. So I clear that, and I don't create that baseline and stick with it. So developmentally and socially, there are resources where you can go and say, okay, at this age, my child should be doing this or should be able to do this. Make that the baseline from which you begin to adjust. Find out who is in your child's life and what skill sets do they see? What skills deficits did they identify? Don't assume that you know everything about your loved one. And this is where I'm going to do a little bit of a tangent, and I'm going to throw myself under the bus with a few stories about myself to illustrate what I mean by this. And again, don't assume, the idea is don't assume that you are the only one who knows your child. If your child has ever gone to another program, to school, anywhere outside of your house without you, with staff members and support and so on, those staff members and support have also had experiences with your child. And you need to find out what those experiences are so that you can gauge how your child is with other people. This is kind of important. And it happens with our neurotypical kids. How many of us have heard, oh my gosh, your child is so lovely, and they have such a good time, and I absolutely love them. And we all go, who are you talking about? Right? That's pretty typical. And let's kind of give some examples of why this is really important. So I'm going to throw myself under the bus, and I'm going to tell you about a document that you can find on my website called The Dangers of Presumed Familiarity. This is what it looks like. It's hard for you to see, so I am going to zoom in on this, and we're going to go over it. Let's talk about my own circle members. And when I say circle, these are the people that are in my life. And this is going to illustrate why we must welcome input from others about the person we love. Okay, so on the left column, you see who is in my life. These are the groups of people that I have in my circle. And here's what they know about me. So my family knows that I like to go to bed early, wake up early, I speak Japanese, and I love live concerts. My church community knows that I'm a Christian, I love to sing, and I don't like to teach. I enjoy visiting different churches and meeting new people. My fitness friends know I prefer small groups to large groups. I'm competitive, and I hate loud music. My disability community knows that I'm a good public speaker. I throw that in just to make me giggle. I'm good at advocacy. I know a lot about autism, and I know a lot about person-centered planning. GGA, those are my girls gone amok. And a few times a year, my girls and I go on, oh, well, a couple times a year, we go on little mini vacations. And they will tell you that I love rum and coke. I love to try local food and food tours. I love the beach, and I like a little alone time each day. And I prefer my own room. So I will bring this back up forward to you for just in just a second, because I want to point out a few things. But again, I bring this up to you, and I here's what I want you to think about. If at some point I ever became disabled and unable to take care of myself in the way that my son Nikki does, your loved one might. And when that happened, the only people who were brought into the room to speak to the people who were going to take care of me was one single one of these groups. And the voices of the others never came forward to give their experiences and add to, for the purpose of the caregivers, any stories or ideas about what I enjoyed. Then they would only get, those caregivers would only get a snippet of who I am. And that worries me. And let me give you an example specifically. If my family was the only one who was informing the caregivers of who I was and what they know about me, they would say that I love live concerts. But if my fitness friends were the only people that were in the room to describe who I am and what they know about me, they would say, I hate loud music. Now, contextually, what I hate is going into the gym, into those stupid spin classes and hearing, or the aerobics classes, and all you hear is a doom, 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 you know what I'm talking about, in those classes. That's the loud music that I hate. Okay, so that's contextual. What do you think the chances would be if, again, my fitness friends were the ones who described me? What do you think the chances would be that I would ever go to a live concert again? Which is one of the things I love so, so much. The chances would be zero. Because what they heard was that I hate loud music without any context, without any further explanation. And so there goes one of the things that I love the most. Really, really important. I could go on and on. You can probably make your own examples of this, but I just want you to think about that. And what I want you to think about is applying it to your own loved one. So when I talk about strategies, I also mentioned earlier the idea of being vulnerable. Please, please reach out to those who know your loved one and ask them to tell you stories about experiences they've had with your loved one, and ask them about things that they know your loved one enjoys or doesn't particularly enjoy. I can guarantee you will learn things about your loved one that you didn't know, and you will be able to transfer that information to the next caregiver so that they can do a better job of providing opportunities for your loved one. No single person can paint the entire picture of another person, no matter how much they think they are the expert. Again, vulnerable moment, but really important. So let's continue on with a little bit more research. Let's take a look at, what does the next step look like for your loved one? Where are they going to live? And within that, what does that setting look like? What activities might they do? And what are the expectations in these settings? And I will talk briefly about what I mean by this. Typically in the educational environment, before our loved ones leave and they graduate and so on, quite often the school system will take off the shelf a book or a list or some sort of guide about transition planning. And in there, they will say things like, well, a person who is going out into the adult world should be able to sign their name, should be able to make a purchase, should be able to do, fill out a job application and so on and so forth. But these are just kind of, like I said, transition checklists. How many of those actually apply to the setting that your loved one might be going into. For my son Nicky, I had to say no, 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 no to a lot of them, because frankly, a lot of them were going to set him up to be more vulnerable. If he knows how to sign his name and somebody knows that he knows how to sign his name, they might have him sign his name on everything. My son Nicky could go up to the counter at the store and give $100 bill and get for a 99-cent item, and the person behind the register could give my son a penny back, and Nicky wouldn't know the difference. So I really had to work hard, and I encourage other people to do the same. And this is what it really means. Where are they going to live? What does that setting look like? What activities might they do? And what are the expectations in these settings? The skill sets for a person who is going into semi-independent living are very different from the skill sets for a person who's going to go live in a group home. Very, very different. So if you are not planning and kind of customizing what this looks like, a lot of times I see people going to conferences and going to workshops and learning about all of these things, and then going, like I did for many years, Nicky's never going to be able to do any of those things. And so none of this applies to me. And so I get frustrated. So customize what you're doing in your research. A few years ago when I was preparing, well, in 2020, it's a little more than a few years now, but in 2020, when I was thinking about how I wanted to write this workshop, one of the things that I wanted to make sure was that I did a little bit of a survey of organizational leaders and caregivers. And I asked them, what are the skill sets that you would list as being the most beneficial, the most helpful for a person who is arriving in your setting? It was everybody. It was day settings. It was group homes. It was semi-independent living. It was shared living. It was all of the settings. And I really sent this out. And what I got back was these. They said, among the things that are most helpful skills upon arrival is that a person has flexibility, that they are able to pivot. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, that they are able to manage themselves when there is a change in schedule, when there is a change in plan, sometimes, tomorrow and sometimes in the moment. A willingness to try new things. Personal care and environmental responsibility, like cleaning, care of spaces, tidiness. Functional communication, asking for help, reporting problems, indicating pain. Interpersonal communication and social skills, and problem-solving skills. And then beyond that, beyond those top 6, additional responses included self-advocacy, safety in public, meal prep, taking meds, following a schedule. So ask yourself how your loved one is doing in these particular areas, knowing that these are the things that have been reported by organizational leaders, direct care workers, and so on as being the most helpful. I don't know that we really think about all of these things as we're preparing for our loved one going to the next setting. So these are really important. And a lot of them, are things that we can be working on in preparation. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, some specific examples in a few minutes. But I thought this was really interesting that these were the responses that organizational leaders and caregivers gave. One of the things that stands out to me is that flexibility. Over the years, I've met so many people who have their children in a rigid activity schedule, from the moment that they get home until the moment that they get to bed, and then the moment they open their eyes until the moment they go to wherever, or the moment, when the day begins at home. And while those things are, again, going back to the things that drive us, that speaks to survival, and it speaks to organization, and it speaks to, just being able to manage throughout the day. So I get it. And those are really important. However, what's equally important is that they're able to, like I said, pivot, be flexible, manage themselves when things do change. So if you're built such a rigid schedule, a few things come to mind. You gotta work on helping them be flexible. And the next setting is not going to look exactly like the setting that you've got going on right now. So all of this led me with one additional professional experience that I had to write something called the sabotage game. I'm going to go on a quick tangent. You can also find this document on my website. Here's what happened that I describe in the sabotage game. I was doing a person-centered plan for a young man in his mid-20s. And when we arrived at the big meeting, the planning meeting, his circle of support, his family members were really excited to announce that this young man had learned and successfully gotten himself to his job site by leaving the house, walking down the street, and getting on the train and getting to the site, and then doing the reverse to get him back home again. And he had been doing this for about a week, and it was great. And this is something that they had been working on for such a long time. I shared that excitement, but as I heard them describing how he did it, I decided to go over to this young man and ask him a question. I said, let's say that you have arrived at the train station and you are on your way to your train. And he said, okay. And I said, let's say a pretty girl comes walking up to you and says, excuse me, there's something wrong with my car. It's in the garage and I need $80 to fix it. Will you help me? And the young man said, okay. And I said, what are you going to do? And he said, well, if I don't have the cash, I'll have to go to the ATM and then I'll go help her to see if I can help her with her car. And there was a collective gasp in the room. And I felt terrible doing this, but it needed to be done to illustrate the fact that with all of the planning and all of the training that was just incredible with this family and the wonderful achievement with this young man, they had failed to think about the reality of the world and that things change, things happen. People can try to take advantage of people that they think are vulnerable. But even things like, what if the train schedule changed? What if he missed the train? What if there was a cancellation because one of the trains was stuck? What I did was I asked the family to walk themselves through every step of all of this from leaving the house to arriving. And I said, sabotage it while you still can, while there is a learning possibility here going on and all of you are in place to support him. Sabotage it. Make things go wrong so that you can get a sense of how they are going to handle when things go wrong. That's the essence of the sabotage game. And like I said, you can see that document on my website. But I think that speaks to, again, one of the things that we underprepare our loved ones for and overprotect our loved ones, thereby causing these things to be left unplanned for. So let's continue to talk about the kinds of things that are strategic in how we're approaching under preparation and overprotection for our loved ones. Let's create a plan. I want you to make a list of the things that are expected in the adult setting, even if it's at home. Even if it's at home, because now I want you to shift your perspective and remember that you have another adult in the home, not a child any longer. If there were 3 people in the home, mom, dad, and the person with disabilities, and the person with disabilities has now become an adult, there are now 3 adults in the home, and we need to shift our expectations to that. Examples include personal care, showering, dressing and undressing, getting up, getting to bed, laundry, housekeeping, asking for help, teamwork, taking turns. The list goes on and on, but these are the kinds of things that are expected in any adult setting for any of us And we need to begin incorporating these skills into the current setting so that we have the runway to help them get the best prepared. And we're going to shoot for maximum person-centered acquisition of skills and not mastery, remembering that skill sets for a person moving into an apartment are different than those going into a care setting like group home or shared living. Now is the time for us to be working on the skills that they're going to need for the future, with the eye toward we want them to be able to do these things without us. With others is fine, but the emphasis is on without us, so that they can be fully ready to the best of their ability to do that. After you've made that list, I want you to make another list of the things that you are doing now, right now, for your loved one. All of the things that you are doing to support them. And then for each of those items, I want you to ask the question, can they do it themselves? Either partially or wholly. And we'll get to that partial part in just a second. What is the maximum level that they can contribute themselves to these things? And begin adding these to their routine. And additionally, continue on that thought and ask yourself, if someone else needs to do it because I'm not there, whether that's momentary or for the future, what should they know? What should those new caregivers or any of the service providers or anyone that's participating in supporting your loved one, what should they know? Think of family members and others who can reinforce these skills. I'm not talking about writing a book about what they should know. I'm talking about what are those things that your loved one is capable of participating in to the best of their ability. Because if they go into their next setting and they can unload the dishwasher, they may not go, hey, excuse me, I can unload the dishwasher. They may not have the ability to say that. They might and just choose not to. But regardless, either way, in the absence of anyone else's voice, which we've already gone over, in the absence of these critical communication skills, they may end up, like my son did, losing skills because the expectation wasn't carried over into their next setting. These are all really important. And I want to do a really quick kind of deep dive into that discussion that from what the slide I just talked about. What is the maximum level that they can contribute themselves when you think about the things that you are doing for your loved one, and you ask yourself, can they do it for themselves? Now, let me go back to a lot of the people that I work with, including my own son. My son, Nikki, and many like him, we don't traditionally think about what they can contribute themselves, except at the point of saying, yes, they can do this entire chore or this activity, or no, they can't. We do a yes or a no, that's it. No part, we don't break it down typically until we start approaching these things intentionally. So let me give you some examples that may or may not apply to the person that you are caring for and the person that you love, but maybe they do. A lot of times I get pushback from parents on this. Well, they can't do all of these things. They can't, pay a bill, write a check, go grocery shopping, choosing things, and so on and so forth. Okay, of course, that's fine. But what can they contribute themselves? And that starts with, before you answer that starts with embracing the belief that every person can contribute to all of their activities and their events and their settings and so on and so forth. They can contribute. So we need to shift our perspective and go from they can't do any of these things to here's what my loved one can learn to do to the best of their ability. And some of those things can be as simple as learning how to wait, taking turns, seeking help, saying help. Seeking is different. My son won't necessarily go over and say help, but he might go over and take somebody by the hand and lead them to where they're needing assistance. Self-entertain. That's a skill that is really important. Indicating yes and no, buckling a seatbelt, pointing to what it is that they're trying to communicate, following someone, stopping when asked to, and reciprocating social language. So when we think about contributions, when we think about things that our loved ones can do, we often think, like I said, we think about the big picture items and we go straight to my loved one should be able to get themselves to work. And that is a great contribution. But if all my loved one might be able to do is simply be able to wait for a staff person for as long as is necessary, because they might need to take a break, go to the bathroom, or whatever. And if your person can't do something that simple, that is universal. So is things like taking turns, seeking help. A lot of these things are pretty universal. So it's okay if your loved one can only start to learn how to do some of these things. It doesn't have to be a failure because they can't master something. Every single one of these things is a way that they can contribute to being good housemates, to being good friends, to being good people receiving support, to being easier to support and serve. All of these are contributions. So don't shut down the idea that they can't contribute. Think instead of what the maximum level that they can contribute might be. Going back to Nikki, I want you to know this. Like I said earlier, he was in a institutionalized hospital-based setting for people with extremely difficult behavioral challenges for 5 years, and it was a terrible setting. It was absolutely institutional, and it was pretty horrible. I will talk about that at another time. But and after those 5 years, we transitioned him to a shared living, kind of a hybrid shared living situation. 2 months after he transitioned, Nikki's behaviors went down by 70% over a 10-year baseline. Sorry, 5-year baseline. They went down by 70% from a 5-year baseline in the first 2 months. I want to point out, before I continue to read the rest of this, which you probably already have, but that's fine. I want to point out that that was not a miracle. That was not some sort of divine intervention. That was there the whole time. But in that setting, they had zero expectations that he would ever live up to being able to be flexible or manageable in any sort of setting other than the one that they had created, which was very, very limiting. So that wasn't a miracle. Nikki got to a place where he was listened to. He was given choices. He was allowed to use the voice that he had to communicate the things that he wanted and didn't want. His whole world opened up. And 10 years later, Nikki has had more experiences, gained more skills, acquired more language, and built more intimate relationships with others than we would ever have guessed, than anybody ever would have allowed, including my husband and I, and then that more than we would ever be brave enough to try. So 2 quick stories. One is a few years ago, I went to an ISP meeting at his day program, and the staff handed me a 4-page list of handwritten words, and in 2 columns on each page, hundreds of words that Nikki was using with regularity that I had never heard come out of his mouth ever. Why? In part because I was doing everything for him and anticipating everything, so we never really had to. But he had gained all this language. Second quick story, he was adjusting the thermostat one evening when I was visiting him in his shared living house. He came running out of the room. I was in the living room with his shared living provider, and he had been down the hall. He came running out. He went right over to the thermostat in the house, adjusted it, and went running away. And I turned to the provider and I went, wait. Did you just see what Nikki did? He was touching the thermostat. And the provider started laughing at me. And I said, what? And he goes, Cheryl, he's been doing that for months. I showed him that you turn it this way to make it more hotter and this way to make it colder. He knows what he's doing. If it were me, I guarantee you I would have one of those boxes over the thermostat from day one that you see in, hospitals and such, where nobody gets to touch the thermostat unless you have the key. That's what I would have done, because I would not have had the expectation, or I would have been too fearful, and so on and so forth, to do some of those things. So the lesson there, among all of them, is that I will always be Nikki's mom, but I no longer know him best. And I am so grateful for that opportunity to no longer know him best. When we have ISP meetings now and DDS comes and says, Cheryl, what are the goals that you want? They actually don't even do that anymore. They know better, because my response is always going to be, go to the shared living provider. I don't live with him anymore. He knows Nikki best, and I will be at the table. I will have my seat at the table. I will talk about my concerns. I will press for more opportunities every single time. But as far as knowing Nikki best, that's not me. All of this takes time and effort and intention beyond what we do for our other children or family members. But putting in the commitment, the time, and the work means that you will have, among other things, a well-prepared young adult with all sorts of options for living and working, fewer health issues, including mental health issues, more chance of stability, which fosters even more progress, confident person with self-esteem, building blocks for positive, healthy, happy, meaningful relationships with others, happiness, joy, and a healthy relationship between you and your loved one that sends a message to future caregivers that you are a positive team member. And you know what? These outcomes are not just the ones that you will see in your loved one. These outcomes can be applied to you as well. Your life will be better of course, things happen. But I can guarantee you that if you simply embrace these concepts to the best of your ability and grow strong, arm yourself, get yourself ready, reach out to the community, find out about how others have been doing these things, you are going to have some good outcomes. You are going to have a person who has the flexibility, who has the strength, who has the communication skills to be able to go forward and receive the gift that I started with, which is the gift of being prepared for life without us. Thank you so, so much for listening tonight. Thank you for thinking about these things. Please go forward, share them, and remember that it doesn't take a lot of strength to hang on. It takes a lot of strength to let go. You are not alone. Keep loving fiercely. Keep teaching daily, yourself as well as your loved one. Keep pushing lovingly, yourself as well as your loved one. And watch your loved one fly. I can be reached at any of these. My website is CherylRyanChan.com. I hope to be launching a new version of that soon. In the meantime, take very good care of yourself and each other. And once again, I thank you. I'm going to have to edit this because now I got to figure out. There it is.